It's a pleasure to host this latest episode of our Fintech Founders podcast. Thank you again to our CFTE hosts for hosting the edition. We have two excellent guests zooming in from Mumbai, India today. Maybe our guests can introduce themselves rather than me sort of mangle their LinkedIn bios, which I have read. But Anupam, Shameek, maybe you can introduce yourself. Oh, Shameek, you've known me sadly for years, but let's not get hope that doesn't get in the way of this conversation. But Anupam, tell us about who you are, what you do, and how you ended up in Truera.
Yeah, thank you, Ranit. First of all, thank you for having us on the podcast. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Anupam Datta. I'm co-founder, chief scientist, and president at Truera. And before that, I was on the faculty at Carnegie Mellon University for about 15 years, the last decade in working in machine learning, AI in particular. My journey began in India. After college there, I went to Stanford for graduate school, and from there to CMU, and then from there to Truera. It's been very exciting to see the developments in the world of AI over the last decade, and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Shameek?
I'm the first client of this company. Back in 2019, as Group Chief Data Officer at Standard Chartered Bank, I was looking for startups that were in the specific area of building trust in AI, because that was turning out to be a big barrier in terms of large-scale adoption of AI. And I met Anupam and his co-founders in the Valley, and that's how I came to know them and eventually joined them in 2021. But more broadly, yeah, my background is in banking, Group Chief Data Officer, Standard Chartered, worked for over a decade in all things around trust in data and algorithms, and this company, as you'll hear, is exactly in that space. So hence my journey here.
Thank you guys for the introduction. Anupam, we were joking before we went live, before the recording started, that we're in this AI moment, and of course you guys know this way better than me, but just from the outside looking at AI from a financial services lens, I remember in 2017, 18, probably, I don't know, was that the first time, Shameek, you and I were chatting about this? I was definitely getting interested in this space because there's a lot of new developments happening, and feels like this is like, I don't know, the fifth, sixth, seventh AI wave in the last 60, 70 years, and there's obviously so-called AI nuclear winters in between. Anupam, put this into a bit of historical context for us. Help us understand, why are we having this moment, this ChatGPT or other moment now, and talk about these waves that we've had in the past, and why did they fizzle out?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if I talk about the current moment, maybe I'll talk about the current moment and then go back in history rather than the other way around. I think of three things having come together to enable the ChatGPT moment, as you call it. Number one is scale. Number two is human feedback and having humans in the loop. Number three is distribution. So on scale, one of the biggest things that happened in the last few years was getting to that point where we can train these massive models on humongous volumes of data. So if you think about GPT-3, which was just the precursor to ChatGPT, that was a 175 billion parameter model trained on pretty much all the text that there is on the internet. So that capacity, which comes with a lot of technology under the hood that has enabled it, has really gotten us to this point where you can train models that have read everything that's ever been written. The second big piece here is, I was referring to it as human feedback. The technical term here is reinforcement learning with human feedback. But what it means is that when you're training these kinds of models, not only are you making humongous volumes of text available for it to learn the structure of language and concepts, but also in that process, humans are employed in a very specific way So historically, when you train machine learning models, you have labeled data which tells the model, is this the right answer to this question, if you will, if you think in the context of ChatGPT. But with reinforcement learning with human feedback, it's going a little bit beyond that. It's telling you, given a set of 10 options, which could be answers to a question, if you were to rank them as a human, how would you rank them? And if you can do that, give that kind of information during training, and that's what ChatGPT leverages, then suddenly the machine not only learns what the right answer is to a question, but it learns about the preference ordering, if you will, of choices. And that combined with some additional technical methods just makes it much better at making the right kinds of choices and sequencing them together, which ultimately leads to a very powerful, in this case, chatbot. So that's the second big innovation, scale, and then this human feedback. The third is distribution. One of the outstanding things that OpenAI did was to make ChatGPT available in a restricted form to anyone in the world, with an interface that consumers can play with through this very friendly chat interface. And we saw the impact of that. 100 million people started playing with it over the course of a couple of months. And now it's in the public consciousness in a way that CEOs of major companies everyone's asking, is there something that we can leverage in a way that will benefit us as a company or as a society? So those are, I would say, the three big things that came together. And there's a long history preceding that led us to this moment. If I were to break down, especially focusing on language processing, natural language processing, we started off with much more linguistic and logical methods, expert systems. That kind of body of work was very popular in the 70s, 80s. Then there was a shift towards statistical methods. So the shift away from logical methods, which at one point was thought to be the answer to expert systems and general ways of answering questions. There was a hype around it at one point, and that might be one of the moments in time that you're referring to. But there was also a realization over time that does not generalize well, because it's a way to answer through deductive reasoning, starting from a base of facts, if you will, or knowledge base. But you're limited by the initial set of knowledge facts that you're putting in, and limited by the rules of deductive logic. So that was one initially it started out as promising, but very quickly people realized that you couldn't get too far just with that as the core engine. Statistical methods started to gain prominence in the early 2000s. And I still remember in 2008 when I just joined the new faculty at CMU, Peter Norvig, who was a Stanford professor, then went off to Google to direct AI research there, had come by to give a distinguished lecture, and he was talking about how statistical methods on n-grams, based on n-grams, which are like you take a word, you break it down into little pieces, and then you can compose things out of that so that you can predict the next word in a sequence, if you will, which is the core of a language model. A language model takes as input a sequence. For example, you might say Gaurav Dhar is, and might predict the next word, a fantastic CEO, or a sequence of words. And so that's the core of the language modeling problem. And in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, logical methods were getting displaced by statistical methods based on this kind of n-gram models. Another big shift happened around 2013, 2014 with deep learning methods coming into natural language processing. The revolution first happened in computer vision around 2012. But around 2013, 2014, these n-gram models started to get beaten by what are known as LSTM models or GRU models. And these deep learning methods could take a sequence of text as input and predict the next word much, much better than what these n-gram methods could do. But they had some weaknesses. One of the big weaknesses was that if the sequence got too long, then they forgot words that were said a while ago, right? It's a bit like an elderly person whose memory is not working that well. And so it was, while it was a big step up, it still had this very severe limitation that if the sequences got too long, which is what many interesting use cases have that flavor, then it didn't remember, and so it didn't do very well. After that, and this is where, if you're about to nod off, I'd encourage you to pay attention, is around 2017, 2018, is transformer models came into play. There was a paper that was very cleverly named "Attention is All You Need." And with transformer models, one of the big step ups was that it could remember long sequences and pay attention to relevant parts of those sequences a lot better through some clever advances in the architecture of these neural networks. And BERT models in particular, which came out of Google, and that was a paper out of Google, now has gotten very, very widely used and has become a core engine for language modeling. And there are a number of other models in that neighborhood. There's DistillBERT and Roberta, various variants of BERT that have seen very widespread distribution and use. If you go to Hugging Face, which is a hub for machine learning models that a lot of developers go to get their models from, a BERT model has had 30 million downloads and more. Right? It's gotten a lot of use. And then after that came the latest sequence of models, which are the GPT models from OpenAI. Google has Lambda. Hugging Face has these models called Bloom and so on. And there the step up were the three things that I talked about: scale, getting human feedback in an interactive way during training, in this kind of where there's an expression of preference order, not just this is the right answer, but that among these 10 answers, they are ranked in this order. And then finally, distribution, with 100 million people now playing with it in the course of 2 months. So I'll pause here. I could speak on this topic for a few more hours, but let me hand it back to you, Ronit.
Anupam, I think we're going to need to have an episode 2 and 3 to unpack all those things you said. But sadly, we only have half an hour more. Before I switch to Shameek, one thing I wanted to pick up on, and he said CEOs, and obviously we're all in the world of enterprise, I guess, at least on this panel. We talk to companies, we work in companies. It seems to have caught CEOs' imagination, investors' imagination, all the jokes about, VCs just want to invest in something with AI now. At least that's the flavor of the month. And also the public consciousness. Unlike other waves of AI in terms of the extent or other new emerging technologies, like, I'm thinking, I don't know, whether it's blockchain or quantum the nearest you could say, and it's not really a new technology, but it's like a group of whatever you call it. About a year ago, we were all going a bit gaga about the metaverse. And it's like that kind of popular interest that existed, and I think will come back on the metaverse, has applied to AI. Then the kind of business and some of the tech, how the techies got really into parts of blockchain. The techies got really into it. Same here. How some of the cultural dialogue around Web3, again, same here. And it just seems that this seems to touch on so many different aspects. The tech, the business, the culture, I'm struggling to frame a question here, but I guess what I'm asking is like, why is it just so become such a big thing right now, particularly from a why do we all have to give corporate presentations now on what AI means for our business? Like, why have there been lunch sessions that everyone's done probably in their company, or breakfast sessions like Shameek went to recently that a friend of ours, let's confess, one of the co-founders of the CFTE organized to discuss how this was going to change all our lives. I don't know what the question there is, but Anupam, help me out with an answer.
Yeah. So maybe I think part of it is that the potential impact of this class of technologies around these foundation models and large language models is very, very far-reaching. And it touches many, many different aspects of every single business that one could conceive of. So the potential impact is really transformative. I think that's one piece of the answer to the question that you didn't quite ask. The other piece, I think, is, and this is where I will weigh in with my personal voice, if you will, especially since you also asked about hype cycles and so on. On the one hand, I think the impact of this kind of technology can be really transformative, and I'll give you a slightly more technical answer to that piece, elaborate on that in a second. The other piece, though, and this is where I would advise caution in optimism, is that it's also extremely, extremely important to make sure that we vet these models before we put them into use, because the cost of getting things wrong here can also be very high. So my key takeaway, if you will, from this entire podcast is, yes, there is tremendous potential in this technology, but we have to deploy it carefully, responsibly, with processes and tools in place to make sure that we are vetting and evaluating and building trust in these methods and models as we go about deploying them and maintaining them over time. Now, returning back to your question a bit about why is everyone talking about it, I think part of it goes back to the fundamentals of what a foundation model is. A foundation model, like a language model, which is, if you remember my example, you give it a sequence and it predicts the next word in the sequence. And then you can keep iterating on that so you can get answers to questions and so on. Is that the word and the term foundation model was coined by a group at Stanford a couple of years ago. The beauty of it is that it can be a core engine which you can then adapt to pretty much any use case that you can think of and fine-tune it for that. So what I mean by that is, at its heart, you have a language model, which given a sequence predicts the next word in the sequence. You can iterate on it to get not just a single word out, but an answer to a question and so on. But then with some amount of fine-tuning, you can specialize it to answer questions around sentiment analysis. So we are in a Fintech forum here. If you want to figure out the sentiment about a particular set of stocks and then use them to build a portfolio, you could do that. If you want this to be a core engine in your customer service efforts, where people come and engage with you through chat interfaces that you have on your app or on your website, you could do that. If you want this to be a way for you to summarize documents because you don't have the time to read them, you could do that. If you wanted to write poems for you, it could do that too. So it's a very, very versatile core technology, which by its very design can be adopted to lots and lots of different use cases through a very systematic process. This is a sharp departure from how we historically built AI models, where you build it in a very task-specific way. You have one model for sentiment analysis, a different model for a chatbot, conversational AI. You have a third model to do topic summarization, document summarization. So you end up with a hundreds of different models which are not connected to each other. Whereas here you start with one foundation model and you adapt it across all these use cases. That is an incredible promise. And I think that's another big reason why people are talking about it.
Shameek, you've been listening patiently to our conversation so far. And you were, I think you said, the first or one of the first clients of Truera?
First client.
First client. You were the first client. Why were you interested in Truera? Like, what made you think, let's deploy these guys, let's try them out in the large international bank you worked for previously? And then the linked question, why were you so interested that you actually threw in your day job as a, sensible banker and jumped into the startup world? What was that? Talk us through the motivation, talk us through that journey, and then talk us through the oh shit moments you've had since then.
Sure. I think the answer to your first two questions are actually the same. They both have their roots. It is now some time back, so I think there's no harm to my previous employers if I quote it. But it does go down to, I had a come to Jesus or come to any God you want moment sometime in 2014 when my then employer was very publicly called out by regulators and had deep trouble with regulators because a very innocuous financial crime model, nothing to do with AI, old school fuzzy logic, was not able to make out, Gaurav runs a payments company, was not able to make out the name of the country in a payments message. I won't go into the details of that, but this bit is in public, that this was the problem. And that cost years of remediation, issues with basic questions about can we continue this business? And that was just my employer, but you will know variants of this story for many other banks, for example, right? And so you start from that and think, okay, here is a really crude, simple model that is used. This kind of model has been used for a very long time, and it can get into so much trouble. An organization, but actually an industry, has got into trouble. There have been variants of this at Citi, for example, where it's not necessarily AI, it's just a small error with data or algorithms can make such a big difference. So the big hypothesis for me around 2017, 18, both professionally for the banking industry, but for myself personally, was that our future is going to be, one of the key drivers of my lifetime at least, is going to be much higher dependence on data and algorithms in everything we do, from our children's school to how we get taken care of in a hospital to every aspect of our life will be much more data and algorithm dependent. And the example I gave made me think that there are so many hidden, there are so many ways of getting it wrong, right? So many different ways of getting it wrong, that surely there has to be something in finding out technology to, or coming up with technology or solutions to make that data and algorithm trustworthy. That was the high level theme. From that high level theme, everything else fell naturally. In Singapore and Hong Kong, which were two of the big markets for the bank I was at, the regulators came out early with guidelines on using AI responsibly. I had to go look for people who can help us with that, found these guys, found their technology good. And then, in line with my thinking on where the future is going, it made sense for me to move there.
You're talking about all of us need to be aware. It's a bit like, I don't know, public safety or road awareness as a pedestrian or as a driver. How do we go about doing it? Apart from obviously listening to a CFTE podcast and not giving too much of a plug to CFTE, but what are the things that to a general interested person, but not an AI or anywhere close to an AI expert, what are the things, Shameek, you would recommend they just have in their mind? Because it's always about the questions you ask, right? What are the questions that you're thinking about, and some of the resources or places they can learn more about this?
Yeah, I think so. So I think there's practically where they can learn more about this, and CFT is a good place. There are other places, but I think to your question, what is that one thing you can do differently? I mean, I'm not even sure you can do it differently. When a random person who you don't know posts something on LinkedIn or even tells you something in a public forum, you don't just take that at its word, right? And so I think I might have privately given this example to you. I'm stealing it from someone's LinkedIn post. I don't remember whose post it was, but it's a really good post. Apparently, the way eggs are sold in US and Europe is very different.
Yes.
In the US, apparently eggs are required to be really cleaned up so that it's protected against salmonella. And in Europe, it's the reverse. They're required to look dirty so that people know, look in their natural form, as in, they may or may not be healthy. You need to take care of that. And again, this is apparently, I shouldn't be trusting random people posting on LinkedIn, but apparently the rate of salmonella
AI moment itself, is
poisoning,
it? It could just be complete BS. This person is
it could be
posting
complete
or
BS,
repeating
right?
it.
But I think the principle of it in this case is really true, right? Which is, if you believe, so the parallel to that is Google search versus an AI chatbot enabled search, right? In a Google search, when you search, whether whether XYZ is the capital of this country, or whether this is a good shop to go to, you don't just take the first thing that appears there and take it as the gospel truth. You keep that critical human faculty of saying, let me take a few points here and there, and then I would collectively take that and make my own opinion. The big difference when everything seems to come out of a machine is that you actually need to go back to roots a bit and build back that critical thinking, which leads me to my second point. To some extent, there is a question of what those of us who are adults can do. There's also a much more fundamental question on how you start teaching in schools and indeed in organizations, like as people go through their life differently, right? And that is probably the most fundamental thing.
Or at least, as the old saying goes, trust but verify.
Indeed.
Gaurav, I know you're dying to ask lots of questions about the Truera business and grill Shameek in particular about how the process of working in a small but growing startup has been after working for a bank that operated in 70 countries or something. I don't know, at least when he was there. So Gaurav, over to you to get into more of the business questions around Truera.
Thank you, brother. Thank you. No, it's been, I have to say, the perspectives and insight, is fascinating. I honestly believe this could be a spin-off series for time to come, looking at the technology, looking at the granular formation of the questions, the approaches, the practical implementations of where this technology goes in different industries or day-to-day life, not only just corporate life. It's really is fascinating to have two people with such insights is a privilege. So I'm happy to listen, to be quite honest, but thank you for that. And taking this opportunity forward, to have the founder and one of the main people forward, like Shameek as well, here on the podcast with us. I wanted to go to the story of Truera, because it's, for our listeners today, we're talking about a topic, but focusing on Truera itself. Anupam, starting with you, could you just tell us, moving from what is extremely deep academia, how did the company start? How did Truera come about? I'd love to hear that story. If you could share that with us, please.
Yeah, certainly. So my academic trajectory, when I started grad school at Stanford, I initially worked in cryptography and security. And that was what my PhD thesis was on. It's a fascinating topic. It's technically deep. And I continue to be very excited about that area. Once I finished my PhD, though, I wanted to, it's a moment of self-reflection. There's a lot of time in grad school because part of the beauty of it is there's time to discover yourself. And one thing that popped up to me in a very central way was that it really mattered to me that I work on problems that have much more direct societal impact. So that led to a transition, and I started working in an adjacent area, which is privacy, which also has overlap with a lot of things that Shameek has worked on in his CDO data officer role. Now, from privacy, as I went deeper into privacy, it became clearer that statistical methods, machine learning, and its intersection with privacy was where some of the key hard and impactful problems were. So that's the area I started looking deeper into. And interestingly enough, with a small cohort of people who had made that transition from cryptography into privacy, I made the transition next to another adjacent area, which was fairness in machine learning. And it began with a study of Google's advertising ecosystem, led from my research group at CMU, where we found gender bias in the way employment opportunities were being targeted, where ads that were about high-paying jobs were shown in significantly higher numbers to men relative to women. That led to another set of questions about why is that happening? What is it about the nature of machine learning models in this particular setup that results in this form of bias, fairness issues? And that in turn led to a body of work around explainability for machine learning, meaning when you get specific types of outputs or predictions coming out of the model, why is that happening? Why is the model appearing to be biased against one group relative to another? But also, when we took a step back, we realized that this why question was fundamental towards understanding trustworthiness and quality of machine learning models in a very broad and general sense. It could be the foundation, if you will, for answering questions about why model performance is degrading over time, which has very direct impact for business KPIs that are driven by machine learning models. So model performance, fairness questions, which are tied closely to responsible AI, transparency questions like that. Ultimately, that became the thinking behind, given how far-reaching machine learning and AI was starting to already be, and I'm talking now about 2016, 2017, the question in our minds, and this is at that time I was working closely with my then PhD student, Shameek Kundu, who's a co-founder of Truera as well and CTO. So around August of 2017 is when we started seriously noodling with the idea of starting a company. We spent a year talking to potential customers across a number of different verticals. Financial services, banking, insurance was one big vertical. Healthcare was another. Tech companies and cloud native companies, like the Lyfts and the Airbnbs of the world. There was another kind of segment there. And in 2017, the market was still quite early. It didn't feel like it was ready for a company like this. But towards the end of 2018, it started maturing, and we decided to start the company and went into operations in early 2019. So we're about 4 years in now, 3.5 to 4 years in. And so that was kind of the trajectory from core research around fairness and explainability in machine learning to an aha moment that assuring the quality and trustworthiness of machine learning models across a number of different dimensions seems extremely important for this kind of technology to both deliver business value and to do so in a way that's responsible and does not cause harmful effects in society.
Thank you for sharing that, Anupam. And Shameek, from your side, moving from one part as a client to joining the family, as it was at Truera, I'd love you to explain to our listeners two things, please, in tandem, if you will. The first thing is, if I pretend I don't know who Truera is, I haven't been to your website, I'm meeting you for the first time, I'm a 15-year-old, young adult coming into space. In 30 seconds to 60 seconds, can you tell me exactly what Truera is? How would you explain it to somebody from that position?
Or a 50-year-old corporate veteran.
Unnamed.
Unnamed.
I'll try. It's always more difficult to explain to 15-year-olds, of which I do have one. Yeah, I mean, put simply, Truera provides software to ensure that AI can be relied upon. So it is a derivative product. It's not AI by itself. It makes sure that AI usage in all contexts can be relied upon by testing it. Trust but verify. This is the verify step before that. That's what we do.
So you're the checks and balances for AI adoption in the commercial world.
Yeah, I mean, it can actually be in in the non-commercial public sector as well. Indeed, we have had some clients or potential clients in public. Yeah, but anywhere you use AI. Yeah. So, I think checks and balances keeps it slightly. I would pick one thing though, or maybe initially it was that it's checks and balances from a bank, head of technology for compliance, chief data officer, regulated entity. But I would say over time, what we also realized, I don't know how clear it is from the outside, but there's a huge gap in the adoption of AI between companies that are data first, technology first, data first, cloud first, heavily technology enabled, typically valley companies or tech startups of various kind, and traditional firms, whether it's a bank or an insurer or a pharma company or a healthcare company. If you look at it purely from checks and balances, it sounds like its objective is to keep it controlled. But I would argue the reverse. The only way the rest of the world is going to get real value, rest of the world meaning those who are not data native, AI native, the only way the rest of the world is going to get more real value from AI is when they get more trust in AI. So those checks and balances you refer to, Gaurav, are actually the way to get exponential growth in adoption of AI. Because if all we did was to prevent the use of AI by putting lots of checks, actually, I think we failed in both my and Anupam's mission. It was never to say keep AI under control. It was always to say build the guardrails around AI so that it can soar. It can really have transformational impact, and that continues to remain our mission.
And maybe one thing, if I can add here, please, Gaurav, is if you think about the software development life cycle, then historically, if you go back like a few decades, there was a lot of effort around developing software, but there wasn't much to support testing and monitoring. Over time, that has become a huge industry. It's over $100 billion industry with CI/CD pipelines and application performance monitoring with the Datadogs of the world. And the analog of that for machine learning is what we are building. And so that's testing, debugging, monitoring of machine learning models. That set of tooling that then lets AI get adopted in a way that the quality of it is also ensured as part of how you build and deploy AI and machine learning. And that is what lets, as Shameek puts it, poetically, I think we've had philosophers now talking for a while, but we also have poets that lets AI soar.
I think the other thing that, when we have our listeners from all sorts of different segments of the entrepreneurship journey, whether they're starting or they're very mature, would love to understand about Truera and coming from both of you, actually, combination. So this question is actually to both of you, not just one of you, is when you're in a space that's very, very typically undefined, there's a lot of work that has to go into building a foundational piece before you can bring it to the rest of the world. Like Ronit had elaborated on earlier, we've gone through so many cycles before, and now we're having a moment. There's so much work that's gone into this. There's so much theory. There's so much, philosophy. There's so much design thinking that's gone into the approach of building AI for actual consumption, whether it's for societal use or whether it's for businesses. We're at that point because of scale and the other factors that you had touched upon earlier, Anupam, that it can be adopted and having the moment as such that everyone's aware of. When you're looking at a business and you're taking it from essentially theory and then putting it into practical execution, and you have to monetize it, right? It's not a very simple journey. What you're doing today in terms of building out a business is it's a blank page. You're really almost having a kind of a Star Trek moment. You're going where no one's gone before, and you're setting the standard, or you're going to, navigate and learn along the way yourself, just like AI does, on what's the correct path to take, right? It's not an obvious path. How do you monetize a business like this in essence? How do you approach that when there's no precedent, is what I'm trying to say. Not only from a product point of view, but from a monetization point of view. Could you, gents, walk us through your learnings, whether it was very simple, and that the market essentially gave you a value to adopt, and it was easy for people to take on the technology from a corporate or a societal perspective? Or has it been a lot of hurdles internally where you, as the C-suite team, along with the founders, have said, we have to try and learn very quickly? And take us through that journey and insight, because I find that truly enlightening for founders that want to create into spaces that have no precedent. And how does that work, if you don't mind?
Sure. Maybe Anupam, I'll take it from the sector that many of the CFTE audience will be from, which is financial services, as in the business in financial. And then Anupam, you can perhaps generalize that. The first thing is, it's not easy. You're absolutely right, Gaurav. And what I would say to people like me who might be, there are many like me, as you know, who are moving out from traditional industries and getting into this space, is do it by all means, but do it in an area where you already have a strong belief, because that's very important. If you're still trying to figure out if not the monetizability part of it, but is this the right thing to do for myself and for the world, and generally, is this the right direction? Then don't do it. If you have doubts about whether this thing has value yourself, then do it. Don't do it. Now, assuming you had that belief, and that is a very big starting point, then I would say a big part of it for me in the financial services sector has been education. Sessions like today's, but not with anything close to Anupam's depth, but much more in a, what you and I already know. And so education, but also education starting from what people already know, Gaurav. Last thing I will say is, you cannot monetize something like this, certainly this one, if you only talk about fear. Fear works for a while, saying this might go wrong. But after a while, people will say, this might go so wrong, I might as well not do anything with AI. Let me just ditch the whole thing, right? So that's why I would come back, Gaurav, like I did with the answer to a previous question. You can't monetize on the basis of, I'll prevent you from causing damage or to yourself or to others. You have to monetize from the perspective of, how does what I'm doing help you do something fundamentally new? Solve a problem for your clients that you've never solved before, right? It's that angle, that I am an enabler for you to do something fantastic. That's super important, because if all I did was kept you in a box and not let you use AI, then I would have failed. So slightly long-winded answer, but hopefully that gave you my view from attacking it with financial services. I don't know, Anupam, if you want to add anything. Sorry, Ronit, you had a question.
Yeah, before Anupam, Shameek, can I just pick up on and maybe slightly challenge the point about fear in a broader context, which is, in our business, the one you and I have spent a lot of years in, financial services, regulated financial services, particularly in the last 15 years, fear sells. If you're making a pitch as an AI company and saying, hey, I can get you a new product, a new business area, a new way of thinking, doing whatever, people are, okay, go and talk to our innovation team.
Yep.
And then you come and say, that big fine you had, you mislabeled the data.
Yep.
The trade that went from A to B, or because your trader was doing something.
Yep.
Or because, just fill in the dots. And I have this really gee-whiz AI / we won't say ML, but, solution. Yep. Oh, yeah. You're going to keep me out of jail? You're going to stop me having $1 billion fine? Come back. We want to talk to you. Don't go to the ventures team in the corner. Talk here. Doesn't fear really sell in finance in the last 15 years?
It does, and absolutely that is how we would have got many of our early signups to come in. Sustaining that interest is a different matter, right? you might get them for the fear, but it's like, if
Right.
that fear leads to shit, this is so difficult, as it did happen
Yeah.
with one of our biggest clients. This
Yeah,
is
yeah.
so difficult, not Truera, but this space is so
Yeah, yeah.
much. I'm just going to go back to my old ways of doing things,
Yeah.
right? Well, then you haven't succeeded. You've succeeded in winning that
Yeah.
first client, but not ramped up. So
Yeah.
I think fear is a great way to get people interested and hooked, and the right people, not just the innovation teams,
Yeah.
from a more mainstream business.
Yeah.
But that's not the way you sustain, right?
Yeah.
You sustain by saying, actually,
Yeah.
not only did I save you from going to jail, but that
Mm.
actually you're going to be able to do these things much better in
Yeah.
an ongoing period. But I agree
Yeah.
with you. If you start off with the world will be much better because you have AI, it's very unlikely that you'll build a new
Yeah,
business.
yeah. It's like, for us middle-aged guys in fitness, right? It's the fear of something horrible happening that forces me to go and cycle or go to the gym or whatever, wear inappropriate lycra, but then there has to be something positive to keep us going, right?
Fortunately for us, we're at capacity for this podcast, so I really think with Ronit, we have to seriously consider kindly finding and stealing some time from Anupam and Shameek when next available to actually do a part 2 or even a part 3 and more on this, because I think we're just starting to get into points of conversation that a lot of people who are listening to us on this podcast or will jump in later on will actually want to touch upon or listen to. And gentlemen, before we leave you, just one final thing I'd like to ask from a pure point of view of say, let's say, inspiration or guidance or advice from your side. People who are becoming aware of AI and the opportunities that it has from a business or learnings or participation or adoption, people who want to get into the space, what advice would you ask them, or would you give them rather, for them to start with their reading or research or learning or coding? Where would you ask someone to start their AI journey if they were just beginning today? Let's just say someone came out of a cave and they saw AI and they wanted to know what to do. What advice or inspiration would you give them where they could then start their learning?
So I'm going to try and answer this in a not very specific way, but I would say don't go and learn about AI. Learn about how what you are doing, whether it's, if you're a journalist. I actually did have a conversation with a journalist who was debating how does ChatGPT change the world, and I said, well, how does it change your life? Did you actually do research on this on ChatGPT first? And yet you actually came to me as a human. So the point I'm making, Gaurav, is my one piece of advice would be don't try and say, let me learn all about AI. That's interesting. But if you really want to understand how it is having effect in real life, pick something close to your heart.
I agree with that. I think that's a great way to approach the area, that if you start with a problem or a question that you yourself have top of mind for you, and then see where that leads. For people who are maybe a little further along, who have been out of the cave for some time and have maybe done a little like an introductory course in machine learning and so on, for them, I would urge them to play with these software pieces, which I'm sure anyone can actually play with it. And then start asking the questions about what is it that would take to make you have more confidence in what you're getting back. So, for example, when you get an answer from ChatGPT, what is the source of that answer? Or even if figuring out the source of the answer is hard for a technology like ChatGPT, are there other sources that could corroborate that answer? And in fact, you'll see that there is a movement in that direction already, where search engines that are leveraging things like ChatGPT are starting to cite corroborative sources that are more authoritative, where you can go and check the answers. That's a step in the right direction. And in some ways, like that needs to become like a baseline for us to have confidence in these technologies. I think also it's worthwhile to Ronit's point is, or from a previous comment, is having some amount of fear can be constructive. So, and on that, it's not that hard to find sources, because what you'll find is that there are already some amount of publicly accessible articles highlighting areas where this technology has some gaps. Examples around hallucination, where it just makes stuff up. Hallucinations are generally problematic when humans have them. But if 100 million people are relying on a piece of technology that hallucinates on some kind of regular cadence, that's worth understanding where those failure modes are. Toxicity is another area. A few years ago, when Microsoft put out its chatbot, it quickly got trained by people over Twitter to start emitting racist comments. That's something to guard against. So I think that's another area where, as you start thinking about the problem that you might find answers to using something like ChatGPT, just go into that next layer of critical thinking around where the blind spots may be.
I think the point about keeping your critical faculties around that Anupam you mentioned, and then Shameek mentioned about find something that you are passionate about and you know very well is a really good one. I've been having days of fun with ChatGPT, and every now and then I ask it a question that I kind of think it's not going to know. So I know this is a weird confession, but I've been getting into not Lycra, but trade finance, historical conventions, and the 90-day bill. So I was trying to get ChatGPT to give me the history behind the 90-day bill of exchange or letter of credit, because there's a convention that finance today, Shameek, as you know, we have these 30-day, 90-day. 90 days are very standard. And a former boss of mine decades ago was telling me a couple of days ago, he said, transport, the journey from Renaissance Italy to London took 90 days.
What, 90 days?
Now, I haven't fact checked him. I should basically work out the speed of a stagecoach per day. But there were quite a few historical books I've read, like, by professors that have this reference as well. And ChatGPT wasn't getting there. It was giving me some very bland stuff about why we have trade finance. And yeah. So if you find something you're really into, whether it's Tintin or 90-day bills of exchange or whatever it is, it's a great way to start. It's been an awesome discussion. We've gone way over our normal time. Thank you so much for joining us, Shameek and Anupam. On behalf of Gaurav and myself, it's been a real pleasure to host you. And if the audience who listen to this recording have more questions, I'm sure they can find you both somehow on social media, or they can reach out to us at CFTE's podcast series, and we'll put them in touch with you. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.